Oh. Well, our class is Faith on the Front Lines, and it is dealing with how to be faithful in a world that has changed dramatically. We are, as I mentioned in the sermon this morning, in a post-Christian culture. And you don't have to be all that old to be able to remember a time where America was very different. The media, the prevailing trends in education were just very different, and now they have changed. But the question is, how do we deal with that? I do want to mention, we were asked about the recording of these. These classes, when they are edited down, which hopefully will occur in the next week or so, will be on our YouTube channel. So they will be accessible. But can you imagine in the workplace or in your friends and family, talking with someone who has embraced secularism? Imagine having a conversation where your words open hearts rather than close them, where the other person feels heard and understood rather than defensive and angry. That's what we're going to be looking at this morning. The question of how do we manage to engage the people around us. There's a book that came out probably 5 years ago now called The Benedict Option. And it basically calls for men and women of faith to hold themselves up behind walls and just do not engage in the world around you because it's not fruitful. The world around is just simply lost. And like the monks in the Middle Ages walled themselves up in monasteries and just waited it out, that's what we need to do. We just need to wait out the dark age around us. And I've never bought into that. I believe that we are called to engage the world in which we live. So the question is, how do we do that, but do it in a productive way? And arguments very seldom are productive. We read in Colossians 4, verse 6, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." This morning, we're going to consider techniques to fulfill this principle in every conversation, particularly with secular nonbelievers, without causing confrontation. Now, as I mentioned in the sermon this morning, it's not always possible to engage without confrontation, because it takes two to have a rational discussion. And there are people who are completely unhinged. When I came back from Korea recently, I was subjected to 14 hours on the airplane with a fellow who was a devout communist. And he was from China. Well, his ancestors were from China, but they had maintained close ties with China, and they go back very regularly. And he just simply was a propaganda mill for the Chinese Communist Party, and he was telling me all the great things that China was doing and how it was just a utopia. And I knew that I couldn't have a conversation with the gentleman whenever he brought up the Uyghurs, because he claimed that the Uyghurs just don't exist. That just like some people don't believe there was a moon landing, that it was all done in a television, that the Uyghurs are just a product of Western propaganda, that they do not exist. And I thought at the time, my goodness, here's a man with whom I really cannot have a profitable conversation. And so I just kind of smiled and nodded and said, well, I see. but there wasn't much I could say. But to the extent that it depends on you, you can have profitable conversations. So, first of all, let's consider the way of building genuine connections. And one of the primary tools that we have is active listening. Now, when we talk about active listening, we're talking about more than just simply waiting for your turn to speak. Now, I am going to say there is a sense in which that's profitable. Not interrupting is a good thing, but you need to go beyond that. And instead of just not interrupting and waiting for your turn to speak from the standpoint of fashioning in your mind what you're going to say, actually take time. Actually listen to what the person is saying and consider it. We need to recognize that listening is a way of honoring another person. James tells us in James 1:19, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." Now, this verse is especially important for us because people who are non-believers are going to say things, perhaps unintentionally, that are very offensive to us, that step on our sensitivities. And the danger is that we will react in a very emotive way rather than being slow to anger and slow to speak. We need to realize that you can be restrained without being compromising. I'm not saying that you pull back from speaking the truth, but I'm saying to be measured in when you speak and how you speak, and to show empathy. This is perhaps one of the most difficult in dealing with a non-believer because their mindset is so different from yours. But if you can get out of your notions and convictions and think about where they are coming from, and ask yourself, in point of fact, even ask them, well, why is it that you believe what you are saying? And you may find that they believe something that you don't agree with, but you at least can understand how they have gotten to that position. Place yourself in their shoes, and genuine concerns can be felt. This, by the way, is especially true of those who have lost their faith. We still live in a country where a majority of people are brought up in homes where there is at least a nominal faith. And people have lost their faith for various reasons. One of the largest religious groups in the entire United States, by the way, are lapsed Catholics. We're dealing with, if I remember correctly, something like 16% of the U.S. population are lapsed Catholics or former Catholics. Well, you talk with someone who is now irreligious, but they were brought up in the Catholic Church, they very well may have a story to tell about the day in which they realized that the Catholic Church wasn't all that it claimed to be. Well, even though you do not share their disbelief, you certainly can understand how they got to where they are. Or perhaps you're talking with somebody who is from an abusive background. Peggy and I are studying with someone now who is having a very difficult time coming to church because the only background that this person had in coming to church was when she was very young. Her mother brought her to church, and her mother had been emotionally and verbally abusive, and they were estranged. And so whenever she visits at a congregation of any kind, all those emotions come back. Well, absolutely, we still believe she ought to be coming to worship, but we can understand how she got to this point of being reticent, to show concern. We're told to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Romans 12:15. Now, this concept of showing empathy extends beyond our church family. But with all people, there is a common humanity. And whenever we engage with people where they are and show empathy, we are able to build bridges rather than walls. And then one of the most important things for us to do, and sometimes it is challenging, is to find common ground. This is one of the primary elements for evangelization. Rather than starting at your points of disagreement, which may be very real, in fact will be if they're a non-believer, find something where you agree. Now, it may be a very slender reed to lie your argument on, but it's there. Because human beings still have some common humanity which you can draw from. Perhaps the person you're talking with has a great deal of compassion for children. And if you're able to start there, saying, there's a lot of evil in the world and there are children who are being mistreated, well, immediately you have something you can talk about. And once you're talking about a moral question, very quickly it becomes natural to talk about the religious solutions to that. You're able to lead them in, or perhaps somebody is very much engaged in the arts. One of the things we're doing in our congregation is this Inklings series, where we're taking pieces of literature and going through them and talking about them from a Christian perspective. This Tuesday night, we're doing The Phantom Toll Booth, which is a children's book. And by the way, we had someone visiting a couple of weeks ago and learning about that we were doing that. Their children had read the book, and so they're going to be watching online because they were fascinated with this. Later this fall, we're going to do Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And whenever you get into the arts and begin talking about the common humanity that is there, very quickly you're able to transition into discussing Christian themes, moral themes, and to find ways of building a bridge. We need to agree where we can. There are very few people you're ever going to run into where you cannot find some point where you will agree. Now, I'm going to tell you, I was not able to find that with the communist on the airplane. Everything he said I disagreed with. But I'm sure that given enough time, I could have found something. But agree where you can. And when you have common beliefs and concerns, it's a wonderful starting point. By the way, we're finding this in our country. Society has become very aware that the secular direction that things have gone, it's not a good thing for children. We're finding that even people who are very passionate in their progressive views on a lot of things have come to realize that children ought not to be exposed to explicit sexual material at a young age. And that, for many, has become a starting point where they're willing to reconsider a wide range of things. Start where people are and help them get to where they need to be. To show empathy, Philippians 2 verse 4, let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Think in terms of other people. Think of what is valuable to other people. And help them to see that Christianity is the best way to meet the real needs that they have. Whenever someone comes to you and they want to have a better home life, do you know what? The way of Jesus Christ is the best way for that to happen. When someone wants their children to be successful in life, do you realize that having an intact family that is guided by Christian principles is the best way for that to happen? When people want to have peace, people are very concerned. They know that their lives are not forever in this world, and they want to know what's on the other side. And the message that there isn't anything isn't very comforting. But we have a message that has comfort, that has assurance. We need, next, to be gracious in our speech. We must not be hateful and bitter people. Now, are there times where it is appropriate to be passionate and firm? There was a meme that was online a few years ago that I kind of liked that said, when you ask the question, what would Jesus do? Remember, driving people out with whips and turning over tables needs to be a point of discussion. Absolutely. There are things that happen in this world where we are not able to say, well, that's not all that bad. No, there are things that are really, really bad. And there are times where we must be firm. And yet, we must not be known as people who, on the whole, all the time, are griping and mean and bitter. We're not called to be bitter. You look through the fruit of the Spirit, and not one attribute of that is bitterness. It's love, it's joy, it's peace, it's patience. And we need to think about the tone and our body language. And this sometimes is the most difficult, because we can frame in our minds what we're going to say, but we can't always picture how we are saying it. Nonverbal cues often communicate more than words. To maintain an open and friendly demeanor. Once again, this is something that is challenging because if it is forced, it's going to look fake. Have you ever talked with someone that you knew was putting on a facade where they had this plastic smile and they were telling you something that you knew wasn't sincere, and they were doing their best to fake sincerity? That doesn't help. But just some simple things, such as knowing whether you're folding your arms and pulling back rather than maintaining a more open demeanor. Knowing whether you are taking time to decompress. Sometimes before you answer someone, just taking a deep breath and consciously letting go of the tension. Don't speak out of anger, but be slow to speak and do your best to be as gracious as you can. Proverbs 15, verse 1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. Something that I've mentioned many times, and yet it's a touchstone for me. I have never met someone who was argued and browbeaten into the church. I know that Ron and Diane would not mind me sharing this because they've been very open with it. Their son that takes care of them, whom they love dearly and he loves them, has not obeyed the gospel. And he is very embittered towards the church. He has a chip on his shoulder. Those are Diane's words. Because Ron's parents were very hellfire and brimstone in their approach. And their son has just dug in his heels and has said, no. They, in fact, Ron and Diane have talked with me about at the funeral. They want my part of the funeral to be a discussion of Ron's faith and the fact that he was able to depart in peace, and to focus on the joy of being a Christian, because they feel that that message might help their son. I've talked with many people over the years who have become defensive because someone somewhere has just beaten them over the head with the good news. I've got good news for you. Let me shove it down your throat. And people react. People pull back. Rather than that, a soft answer and turn away wrath. Now, let's get down to some tactics. First of all, asking clarifying questions. This is part of active listening. Just simply ask someone, well, why do you believe that? Whenever somebody says the Bible's full of error, just ask them, why do you believe that? And sometimes they won't have any answer to that. It's just, well, I've heard that's the case. So, well, maybe you ought to read it instead of just assuming. But if somebody says that they don't believe there's a God, just ask them, why do you believe that? Where did you get that idea? And let them talk. Because you may find that when they talk it through, that they themselves will realize that they're just parroting what someone else has said. Whenever you ask clarifying questions further, it ensures you understand their viewpoint. And it does help them reconsider their own reasoning. For example, whenever you've got somebody who has turned against religion because of some tragedy in their lives, all the stuff that they talk about, the lack of faith in God, the lack of confidence in the Bible, that may be just beside the point. Because what you really are talking about is a hurt that they've had in their lives for many, many years. When I lived in Nashville, I attended a history symposium, and I was seated next to a gentleman who at that time would have been in his 80s. And when he heard that I was a preacher from the Church of Christ, he felt compelled to tell me that he had grown up in the Church of Christ and that his mother was a faithful member, but his father was not. And his father died very young. And at his funeral, the preacher had come by and had said to the mother, well, you know, he was such a good man. It is so sad that he is in hell now. Well, this man had been carrying that bitterness for 70 years. And that had informed his entire perspective of the churches of Christ. Now, whatever else he might say about the Lord's church is really beside the point. The real reason for his opposition was that bad experience. If you ask and you find a bad experience like that, you can help empathize. I mean, just simply by saying, you know, that was a horrible thing for someone to say, and no one should ever say something like that in that kind of setting. You can validate his hurt, and maybe that could lead to a discussion that would help bring him around. Proverbs 18:13. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. We need to be listeners. We need to ask questions. We need to hear. And then we need to avoid judgmental statements. Now, this is a very difficult point because our world has latched onto this concept of being non-judgmental, and what they mean by it is completely unbiblical. It used to be that the most quoted scripture was John 3:16, what Martin Luther called the gospel in miniature. Now the most quoted scripture is judge not. Well, whenever you think about being judgmental, whenever you are hateful, whenever you are harsh, the Bible condemns that. When you are self-righteous, the Bible is very clearly in opposition to that. Now, this is not saying you should never render a judgment, but you need to be careful in how you do it. And judgmental statements can be very harmful when you're working with someone. We need to keep language non-confrontational and inviting, rather than pulling out the brass knuckles and going to war over everything. Take a moment, pull back, and again, without compromise, be engaging rather than building barricades. Verse we used this morning. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. To be merciful with those with whom we disagree is an important thing. To recognize that even if they are wrong, and if they're a non-believer, by definition, they are wrong, we've got to remember that you and I have been wrong about a lot of things. And we need to have mercy because we have been shown mercy. I've had a situation in my own life which has always struck me. I grew up being premillennial. That was what my family believed. Very fanciful, oh my goodness, far-flung ideas. I mean, we believed that there was actually going to be a physical kingdom in Jerusalem. And by the way, growing up, I believed it had to have happened in the 1970s, that there's no way that it couldn't be, because you do the math and you look at when the state of Israel was founded and all of this. Well, I got to college, and one of my favorite professors, Harvey Floyd, when he found out what I believed, he just said, well, great, can we look at the Bible? And rather than browbeating me and belittling me, he just turned to passages of Scripture, and we sat there, and he said, what does this passage say? Let's read it together. And then he would ask me, what does it mean? Well, you begin looking at the passages that talk about an eternal kingdom, and where Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. Well, Dr. Floyd never had to beat me over the head with the Bible and say, get that false notion out of your mind. He was able to lead me with mercy. Well, when people have wrong ideas, to help them proceed. By the way, someone who does an outstanding job with that is Phil Sanders. He has a series of lessons where he has led people through a study of the Bible, and he has actually a 100% success rate of those who complete the study. Now, I emphasize that because some people don't complete the study because they see where it's going and they don't want to go there, so they stop. But his approach is just simply, let's open the Bible, and if you believe the Bible's the Word of God, let's talk about it. And he says, what does this passage mean? Because it's got to mean something. Now, he did hit one lady where there was a passage dealing with baptism, and she told him, my Bible doesn't say that. And he said, but it's right here. It said, no, my Bible doesn't say that. Well, what translation are you using? Well, she was using the same translation he was. And he said, well, let me see. She had taken a penknife and had cut that verse out of her Bible. So literally, her Bible didn't say that. Well, what can you do? But if you are gentle with people, and if they are honest and open the Bible, it's amazing where they will go. We need to craft answers that are seasoned with salt. And one of the things that I'm very, very interested in is for members of the church to be informed. And there are two areas where you need to be informed. One is you need to be informed about the world in which we live. You need to really know what people are teaching. Whenever we talk about the alphabet soup of perversion and what they teach and what they practice, I know it's hard. I know it is very revolting to really get into, but you need to realize that whenever they talk about celebrating a Pride Month and the Pride Parade, what you're talking about is a bunch of men running around, many of them with practically no clothes on, acting out sexual performances. And you look at the videos of these things online, and there are children present watching all of this. Well, that's not what I want to see. I'm going to tell you, we need to know that that's happening. Senator John Kennedy was recently in the news because they had an official from the Department of Education who was making claims that parents should not be determining what children will be reading. They shouldn't be able to ban books. Well, he pulled out this book that was designed for 10-year-olds that is on the reading list in the library of public schools, and he just pulled it out and started reading from it. And it was a very, very graphic description of sexual acts between two boys. And when I say graphic, it was very graphic. And the official was visibly not wanting to engage in discussing that. But you know what? We need to know that that's what's being taught. We need to know what is out there, but something that's even more important. We need to know our own faith and the common questions around it. We need to be prepared for effective dialogue. By the way, whenever we talk about knowing your own faith, do you know the single biggest point of discussion that you need to be prepared for in dealing with non-believers? It's the question of bad things. Why do bad things happen? And by the way, that is the only question that Christians really need to be prepared to offer a defense. Everything else, there are claims non-believers make, but the ball's in our court. It's at least neutral. You know, the non-believer says, well, look at science, and we can say, okay, let's look at science. That's not proving anything against God. The only argument that is put forward in a positive way by non-believers is the problem of pain or the problem of sin, the problem of bad things. And I'm going to be very clear. There are no simple answers. So you need to be ready and you need to be prepared to acknowledge that's a very good question. And I deal with that question too. But of course, it also leads you to the idea of the very fact that you're asking about things being bad. You have at least bought into the idea that there's such a thing as good and evil. And then the question comes, well, where do you get that idea? Unless you believe in God. But we need to be prepared. Likewise, we need to be prepared for the questions about the Bible. Do you realize there are things in the Bible that are very difficult to understand? You know, the Apostle Peter said that about Paul's writings. And whenever somebody brings up some difficulty in the Bible, I don't despair. I look at them and I say, you know what? I've got a lot more questions than that. But having the questions does not undercut the reality that the Bible's the Word of God. It just means I don't have all the answers. 1 Peter 3:15, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Always be ready. Be ready to talk about your faith. Every Christian, I believe, should have what in business is called an elevator pitch. Whenever someone asks you, why are you a Christian? You ought to be able in 3 or 4 sentences to say, this is why. Now, there may be a whole lot more that you need to say, more to discuss, but you need to be ready. You shouldn't be deer in the headlight. I don't know. I hadn't thought about it. You need to think about it. You need to be prepared. And you need to make it personal. By sharing personal stories. They resonate. Because you know what? You can't argue about a story. Whenever someone says, well, why are you a Christian? And you talk with them about the way in which Jesus has helped you through hard times of life, the non-believer can't look at you and say, well, he didn't. Well, no. You're just telling them what you experienced. And they will hear it and they might say, well, that hasn't been my experience. But at least they cannot deny that that was your experience. To make it personal. I love what the psalmist says in Psalm 66:16. Come and hear, all you who fear God, and I will tell what he has done for my soul. We're not talking about an abstraction. We're talking about something that is real. And if you have been touched by the love of God in Jesus Christ, you have a story to tell. And it's something that really can't be argued about. Once again, a non-believer might very well say, well, that hasn't been my story. But they can't deny that it's your story. And when they hear it, they're likely going to, at some level, realize that your story sounds a whole lot better than their story. Because your story ends with an eternity with God, and their story ends in nothing. You have a better story. You need further to be patient and consistent. There are people who are transformed with a moment like that, but not usually. Usually change doesn't happen overnight, so you need to be ready for long-term engagement. And as long as somebody is talking with you, there's always hope. Keep those lines of communication open because you never know. And there's a delicate balance. You don't want to nag, but on the other hand, you do need to be ready to cycle back and to see if something has changed. Don't just ask once, but over time, make it clear that the door is open. And we find the power of conversational grace. There's a world in need. It's a divided world. Things are very harsh. The power of gracious, thoughtful dialogue is more needed than ever. Even people who are non-believers are tired of bickering. They're tired of the bitterness. And if you present the good news as it is, as good news, and you present it in a gracious way, it's going to sound refreshing. And of course, we think of the ultimate example. While we do have the example of Jesus being very direct, we think about the 7 woes he pronounced to the Pharisees, or what I mentioned earlier of him driving the money changers out of the temple. But you know, those are the exceptions that prove the rule. Overwhelmingly, his interactions with people were gracious, were measured, and they were designed to help people move from where they were to where they ought to be. And as we began, our aspiration, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. In doing this, we can be effective in sharing the good news. Steve, what have I left on the table?
Well, I was thinking about the fact that what people see of the church is the members of the people. They don't automatically say, oh, it's Jesus and God founded this perfect church. What they see are the imperfect people who have either become members or whatever. So they see the denominations that have failed, and they see the person who had that awful conversation like the ones you described. And we need to remember, we need to follow, the things you said are great, to make sure we're not the one putting a bad face on the church because of the way we act. And so that's really important.
Exactly. Well, the bell has rung. Thank you all for being here, and we will pick up next week in our class.